Hello, everybody. It's I say good to see you. I can't actually see anyone, so I'm going to trust that people are there. It's great to be with you this afternoon. My name is, you can see on the screen, is Garry, and I work for Impression, a digital marketing agency here in Nottingham. I'm going to be talking to you today about the art of planning content for unplanned scenarios, which we've all experienced, I think, to a great extent during the pandemic. And just a quick reminder as well, if you have any questions during the course of this talk, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, because I will be able to get to them at the end of the presentation. I think we're good to go. Awesome. Just a little bit more of an intro to me. I won't dwell too much on this, but as I say, I work at Impression. I've been here for about 5 years now. And my background is in SEO, although within that I specialize in content mostly for websites. Which comes from sort of my background before that as an English student and copywriter and things. So that's really my bag within SEO. But in general, written communication is something that I enjoy looking at. And this presentation today will hopefully be more broadly looking at written communication rather than just SEO. And if you're not sick of my voice after this presentation, you can check out the Rank Up podcast as well, which is an Impression podcast. So if you like this, there's more of this kind of stuff there. But I won't dwell too much on that. I'll get into the topic. So today we're going to be looking really at what we can learn from the pandemic in terms of reacting to unplanned situations with our content. So as I'm sure we've all been aware, what we'll look at first is kind of how COVID has disrupted our marketing plans. But importantly, some good responses from that, and what we can learn from those responses that might help us take strategies forward that we can use to be more reactive in an effective way in the future. And so once I've looked at a few examples of those reactions, we'll go into 3 takeaways from them, which hopefully you'll be able to apply whatever sort of channel or industry you're in. So we'll be looking at how to make sure that reactive or topical content aligns with your goals. And we'll look at a few different ways to find data for that and to make sure you're not just sort of going off opinion all the time, because it's nice to marketing to be backed up by data. So what kind of sources we have to look at what's worth talking about at any given time in our industries. And finally, we'll look at the practicality of how to actually make time for reactive content. Because we can't always just drop everything and jump on the latest trend. So we'll look at some ways that we can work those into our strategies and actually be able to be effective with that kind of content. And then, as I said, at the end, there'll be time for some questions. So please do pop them up in the Q&A as we go. And I also just want to say, hopefully these ideas will apply to all kinds of content. So my focus is on websites in my day-to-day job. But if you work in social media, advertising, SMS, whatever channel it is, then there's likely going to be some aspect of written communications and having to be aware of the topics and trends in your industry. So I'm really hoping there'll be takeaways throughout that you'll be able to take into those different industries as well. So I want to get started with looking at the benefits of planning, because while COVID has shown us that our plans can go out of the window at any given time, there are still benefits to it. We still like our plans in marketing. So I want to acknowledge that for a number of reasons, it's worth, even when we're thinking about unplannable scenarios and being reactive, it's worth thinking about that in the context of our plans. Because plans help us to make sure that we're still working towards a goal, and particularly that we're in line with our wider business goals. And then within that, I'm sure we'll have our goals for our marketing channels as well. They also allow us to allocate resources over a long period of time, especially if we're working to a 12-month plan. It's important to be able to put financial and time resources in the right place at the right time to make sure that we're able to deal with important things within our industries. Financially, it helps us to get sign-off, especially if we're doing larger campaigns. If we have a plan in advance, we know what kind of budget we'll need. And if we need to get sign-off from elsewhere in the business, it means we can do that. And finally, it allows us to manage our own time and the times of people in our teams and make sure that we're able to put the time in that we need to different projects to make sure things are done well. So all of this means that plans in themselves are great, and they're not going to go anywhere in marketing for the foreseeable future. However, 2020 has shown us that we really can't plan for everything. And COVID is an extreme example, but I think there's learnings from this that we'll be able to take for hopefully more minor examples in the future. And this is one example from a client of mine who supplies windows, doors, and conservatories. So they were very badly hit in the first lockdown when their business had to close. As I'm sure this will be a familiar sight for a lot of people working in all sorts of industries. We can see that in the first month of the pandemic, when lockdown started in March and then into April, their traffic just dropped off a cliff. So this is people coming onto their site, dropped off a cliff in March into April because the business wasn't able to take orders. And a lot of people were also just worried about their jobs and financial situations. So big outlays like big home installations just weren't on people's radar. But then it came back in a huge way. Almost as soon as the first lockdown started to lift, the business reopened. In May, they started climbing back to the levels we saw pre-lockdown. And then in June, they hit record levels of traffic really quickly, which was great while it happened. I can't say we could claim any particular credit for that. It was simply that demand went huge at this point. But then what was particularly tricky to deal with after that is that the demand stayed at a pretty high level throughout the year. And I know there are other industries that have had this as well, where demand has just gone completely different to the seasonal expectations that we might have. So we had to really think about how do we adjust our plans and what's even worth us doing during this period of time when, to be honest, the company's order book was full for the rest of 2020. So we weren't really running offers or trying to really push people during the winter months. We just had to kind of adapt and almost make things up as we went along. And there were topics that, again, this will be familiar to a lot of people, I'm sure. Topics hit us out of nowhere, words and phrases that all of a sudden we were using loads more than we'd ever done before. So this is Google Trends showing furlough over the period of the last 12 months. You can see it skyrocketed in March when it basically came into public usage for the first time for a lot of us, and then had little spikes throughout the year as the furlough scheme was changed and there were various announcements. But I remember at the time within the SEO and digital PR communities, there was huge buzz about how do we make the best of this? Everyone was pumping out furlough content, and all of a sudden we were experts in a word that we'd never heard of before that time. And certain products as well saw various spikes in demand that we wouldn't have seen before, again, completely out of season. So this is an example for the Nintendo Switch as a topic from Google Trends. And you can see in the middle, you've got the, there we are in the middle, you've got the spikes for Black Friday and Christmas in 2020. But then normally we would expect a really quiet new year. But as soon as we hit March, that demand skyrocketed. And then it kind of settled back down into a pattern before the winter was big again. So if you're in an industry selling products like this, we suddenly had to scramble to say, how do we adapt to this demand and how do we work out quickly what people are looking for so that we can show them the kind of content that they want to see. There were some great examples of people responding. So while we couldn't plan for the specifics, I think there are some awesome learnings that we can take from this. Where people were suddenly forced to be very innovative and forced to come up with ways to adapt to the pandemic that give us ideas that we can take away and hopefully apply in the future, which will be the second part of this talk. So I've spoken to a couple of people within the industry to get some different perspectives. So it's not just me and my clients that we've been working on. So first and foremost, this was the insight I got from the JC, the Search Strategist at Cancer Research UK. So dealing in a very unique sector, really, not only a charity, but also sort of related to healthcare and health information. And the big challenge that faced Cancer Research and other sites in that sort of area was that suddenly there was a complete lack of in-person appointments available for their target audience, really, to find out information about cancer. If people had concerns, whether about themselves or about family members, suddenly you can't go to a GP. Hospital appointments might be cancelled. And Cancer Research realized that there was an opportunity here for them to provide a really valuable service to their audience. And while this isn't commercially driven, because they have slightly different goals as a charity, they realized their audience was looking for something online at a scale that they've never looked at before, but Cancer Research realized they had the resources to put out medically vetted information and provide insights to these people, particularly to vulnerable people who really needed it at the time. And they were able to turn that around very quickly and respond to the needs of those people in a really tangible way. And then in a more commercial environment, Kev Wiles, who at the time was working at Halfords last year in their SEO team, they had a situation, again, related to a lack of in-person time, where they were noticing that people weren't able to have the experiences in their stores that they would have had before. So for Halfords, you wouldn't just go shopping. You might go to get a bike fitting or maintenance for your car even, or to ask about a product. And they realized that customers were missing out on this, but the demand was still there. And a lot of people were starting to phone up to customer service and using other channels like that to try and access the information they would have found in store. But within their content team, they realized that they could take some of that weight off the customer service team, and by looking at sales trends and using real-time data from during the pandemic to work out what topics are people looking for, what products are people buying that we know they're going to be asking questions about in a week or two, and then making sure that content was accessible on the site so that people could find it really easily and maintain some of that experience that they were missing out of in store, which will hopefully build up brand loyalty, as well as taking some of the strain away from customer service, as we'll look at in a little bit. Away from SEO, one of my colleagues shared this example with me where Marmalade, who does car insurance for young drivers, ran a digital PR campaign using data exclusively from the pandemic. Because the challenge for them was suddenly people weren't taking driving tests. There were fewer young drivers and new drivers who needed car insurance. So to stay relevant and to stay in a conversation with their audience, they found data specifically about money that people were losing by essentially taking a theory test and then not being able to take their practical test, using that data to calculate the overall money wasted during that period on theory tests, and have a conversation with their audience, raising an issue that people may not have been aware of, showing themselves to still be a really relevant brand and still a brand that hopefully would remain throughout, top of people's minds throughout the pandemic, so that they would consider them further down the line, and also having other digital PR benefits of being able to gain coverage through this and ensuring that they were still able to do something tangible and have some kind of output at a time when their services maybe had a lower demand. And finally, one example from my own experience, a law firm that I worked with really needed to tap into the furlough thing. But we really struggled to find a way to do it in a way that was engaging until one of their tax solicitors came to me and said furlough fraud is a really big problem and businesses and individuals are starting to run into this and they're starting to ask for advice. So that led us to putting a blog up, which he wrote using his expertise on the site. And even just in the few months after it was published in November 2020, it became one of the top performing and importantly top converting blogs on their website, because suddenly people could see that they were talking about a topic that was really relevant right now, relevant to them, and that this was a law firm who was going to be able to address their needs. So those are a few examples, and you don't have to remember all of the details from those examples, because what I want to do is draw out a few key takeaways that can hopefully help us into the future. Because we're all hopeful this pandemic is not going to be around forever, and eventually we hope some kind of normality will return. But I think it would be a shame to waste some of the experience that we've gained through being able to be reactive and through suddenly realizing actually we can meet sudden shifts in demand with really intelligent, thoughtful content. So a few takeaways that I'm going to touch on are how we can make sure that our content aligns with wider goals, because it's important that even if we're talking about the latest trends or whatever in our industries, that there's a purpose to us doing so. We shouldn't just be jumping on something because it's a trending topic or because it's popular. We need to have a motivation for it. Secondly, I'm going to look at some sources of data that you can use to back up the research that you're doing, whether that's to justify to stakeholders why you're writing certain content, or whether that's just to do your own research and to find the kind of topics that you should be writing about. And finally, we'll look at the practicalities of how to make time for these topics, because we can't always just drop everything and shift to talk about a topic that may have just erupted all over the news one day or something like that. And what I want to say with all of this is that whatever channel it is that we're working in, SEO, PR, email, social, SMS, whatever channel, we can all learn to be reactive in the right ways. And this isn't just about being reactive for the sake of talking about hot button topics. It's about being reactive in a way that's actually going to propel our companies towards whatever goals we're working towards. And the key is not for us to stop planning, but for us to allow space in our plans to meet the unexpected in a really effective and hopefully meaningful way for our companies. So we'll get into all of this now. So first of all, look at how to align our topical content with our wider goals. We want to prioritize content, first and foremost, that we know is going to have a direct impact on conversions with our brand. And this is something that we saw with that law firm I just mentioned. Talking about furlough fraud meant they were talking about a topic that was directly relevant to an audience who might be seeking their services. And if people were immediately concerned about furlough fraud, it's likely that they were going to ring up and have that conversation straight away. So we did see direct conversions from a blog post, which is actually quite unusual in their industry. But even if we can't get content that directly leads to conversions itself, I think it's still helpful that to look for trends that can help us to align with wider commercial goals. So an example for this is Kev at Halfords. Although his content to do with FAQs and help for their products wasn't leading to more product sales, largely because people had already bought the products, it was enabling the customer service team not to need as many resources and not to need as much time and money pumped into that, which saved the company money overall. So it still achieved a commercial goal, even though it wasn't sales. And finally, not everything has to have an immediate commercial impact. Sometimes it is good enough and part of our goals to simply meet our audience needs, maybe higher up the sales funnel, to provide valuable information in the way that cancer research did, to put those companies and brands top of mind so that further on when people do have commercial needs, they recognize the brands and seek them out. And what Marmalade was doing with their digital PR campaign was similar, because they were making sure that they could still be part of the conversation, even while they knew people weren't searching for their services. So it just made sure that people would seek them out further down the line. It still had a goal for their audience. And whatever content it is that you're looking at, I think it's really helpful before writing anything, before considering what type of content you're going to put out to meet that topic, important just to think how it's going to meet those goals, and maybe what channels are going to be appropriate to help you meet that goals. Maybe addressing something in an email or some kind of direct communication with a customer like that is going to be more effective at getting them on a topic and driving them towards than simply putting a blog post. Or if you're trying to reach new people, new audiences, and kind of show them that this conversation is going on, maybe that's when something like a blog post or a social post, even something that you push with a bit of paid budget behind it, maybe that's a more effective way to reach those people than putting these messages in a direct communication. So it's worth thinking about this and tailoring your activity afterwards. Secondly, to look at the type of data, because I think some of these campaigns use really interesting sources of data. It's important to be aware of what's actually out there to help us create this content. And first of all, I just want to say there are some really good data sources out there that probably a lot of us in marketing are used to already. For me in SEO, we love keyword research, which tells us what people have been looking for over previous years. We also, probably in multiple channels, we like looking at what our most viewed content is and what pages have worked historically. We might look at where our competitors are doing well, maybe where are they getting the most engagement on social media. We might simply be using our own knowledge of our business's past successes and seasonal trends and using those to inform our content. And all of this has a place in a marketing plan, but it doesn't necessarily enable us to be reactive to something that we can't predict. So there are a number of sources we can use. And ultimately what these sources have in common and what we want to look for when we're trying to find good sources of topical content is that the data is real time or near enough. So it goes right up to the day or possibly even the hour, the minute of where we're looking at now, so we can see what people are talking about right now. We want to look for data sources that allow us to tap into the messages that we want to put out and give us inspiration that's going to align with what our business can actually talk about. We want to look for sources that also help us understand our customer journey, maybe give us insights into how people are looking for our products right now. And finally, we've got a number of sources here, so hopefully you can find something that's going to fit with your wider goals, whether those goals may be more commercial or more to do with brand awareness. So the first of these, and this is an example that came from Kev's Halfords example that I've already shared, use the latest sales or conversions. If you want to see what's interesting people right now, week, month, and see what people are buying, because it's likely that those products or those services are going to inspire the content that's going to engage people now. They might alert you to new seasonal trends that you weren't aware of, or it might just highlight products that you weren't really aware of as being a good performer, but maybe actually will give you a good idea of how to engage with people through blogs, FAQs, or even where you should be pushing your advertising at the time. Second, customer service insights is a really, really valuable way to understand the questions that people are asking your business. So for understanding the user journey, if you have a customer service team, of course, you can ask them, what is it that people are asking you? What problems are people running into with our products and services? And maybe you can create some content on your site or through other channels possibly even through emails if it's a really common question, to say, here are some common questions and here are answers to you, so you can go away, have a great experience with our brand. We know what you're thinking about, and we want to make sure that you have the best information possible to use our products and services as well as you can. Along similar lines, and this is the case with that law firm where we did the furlough fraud blog post, speaking to your product or service experts is another great way to understand what people are asking. Because for these lawyers, they speak to clients face to face. They know the sticking points that people have. So if you're looking for what's top of clients' or customers' mind right now, speaking to the people who are on the ground, delivering your products or services is a great way to start. Then away from maybe direct insights from your customers, setting up a news or email alert is a great way to stay on top of what's going on in your industry. And you can do this for Google News really, really easily. And there are plenty of, we've all seen it, plenty of news sites, probably industry specific sites as well, where you can sign up for, you can subscribe, sign up for email alerts and things like that. It's a simple one, but it is a great way to stay in touch with what's going on right now. Google Trends, I've used a couple of examples from here already in the presentation, but if you want something akin to sort of keyword data or something that gives you maybe some kind of numerical reason for pursuing certain topics, then Google Trends is a great way to see what's popular right now and what people are thinking about at the moment. And it gets you a lot more recent data than looking at, say, keyword research tools or other historical tools like that. And finally, using social trends and forums. So if you're on social media channels, be following people in your audience to understand what they're talking about. Keep an eye out for industry relevant hashtags and check in on those. And also be aware of maybe industry forums or particularly subreddits. If you haven't really looked around the social media platform Reddit, I highly recommend it, and seeing if there are subreddits there, they're sort of group areas, community areas which relate to your product or services, because this is another way to just see what conversations are people having right now. And I was actually just reading an article this morning where one of the recommendations is using subreddits to find the language that people are using to talk about your products. So when you're communicating topical things or talking about the latest issues, you can do so in a way that your audience will relate to and use language that they're already sort of primed to understand and be receptive towards. So those are a few ideas. You may be able to think of more, but as long as you're looking for data that's real time and in line with the kind of topics and messages you want to be putting out, then I think you'll find a lot of inspiration in channels like these. And finally, the third takeaway is simply how to make time for topics that you can't predict. So this goes back to what I was saying at the start with we like plans, and it is okay to plan for unplanned scenarios, as the title of this talk suggests. So I've got a few examples of how I've been aware of this being done, and hopefully these will inspire you to think of ways that might be more appropriate for your working environment and the way that you work. But these are just some examples to get you thinking. So with this law firm that I work with, we actually specifically had a conversation with them because they were regularly in situations, and this was pre-pandemic, they were regularly in situations where their lawyers wanted to write about topics or had blog ideas and wanted to communicate things on a pretty ad hoc basis through the website, but they needed our expertise to do that. They needed our help kind of refining the content and getting it up on the site. So we actually agreed with them to do an extra day a month on top of our other strategic work to help get this kind of content on the site and be able to adapt straight away and say, yep, we've got the time to do whatever topic, write about whatever topic it is that's being mentioned. And this is a very agency specific example because we sell our time, but a way that this could be applied to a non-agency or an in-house example might be simply saying that you're going to set aside a certain amount of time each month to do a bit of research. That might be a little bit of time each morning to do a bit of research on social media or in news. It might be a certain day, a week, or something where you say you're going to do a bit more in-depth research and commit to writing some content. Whatever it is, if you can just set aside a little percentage of your time to actually put some thought into this kind of reactive topical content, you'll likely find that there's A, a lot more out there than you maybe thought already, and B, you can actually create some really good stuff to engage with it if you allow yourself the time to do so, rather than seeing it as an inconvenience that you have to drop everything and adapt to as soon as a news story breaks in your industry. Similarly, another client I worked with, we were actually doing a blogging strategy for them last month, I think it was now. And as part of this blogging strategy, we realized that actually we needed to allow some time for content that we couldn't plan in advance. They're a book retailer, and it means that a lot of the kind of content they need to produce is governed by what's trending at the time, which could be influenced by book releases. The example from earlier this year for them was the Bridgerton series on Netflix, which was hugely popular and based on a series of books. And that kind of hit the industry a bit out of nowhere with its popularity. So we need to be able to adapt to situations like that. And that's one example, but there may be other things that you can think of in your industry. What we said for this was essentially we've got time to do 4 blog posts a month. So we're going to plan 3 of them because we know that there are topics that have just a high demand all the time. So we're going to do sort of best of lists, going to do spotlights on some particular authors, we'll do spotlights on particular genres, that kind of thing. But for our 4th blog post a month, we're just going to say every month, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at what's important to the audience right now. So a couple of months ago, that was doing a review of the Bridgerton series to kind of capitalize on the craze of the Netflix series. But in the future, that may be, okay, there's a new film that's been announced that's based on a book. Or it might be Stephen King, a hugely popular author, is releasing a book this month, so we need to adapt to that. And again, by scheduling it in advance, we make sure that we're going to have the time to actually do that. Again, rather than having to rush it or just ignore it because we're planning these other blog posts and we don't have time to get to it. And finally, again, planning ahead with other types of content, and I've put guides and FAQs here, but this could apply to sort of larger email content, videos, any other kind of content that takes a bit of time to create. You can plan ahead and say, yes, we know we're going to work on FAQs, or we're going to do a video strategy in 6 months' time. So we're going to really focus on our YouTube channel in 6 months' time. And that's great. You can plan ahead, but you don't necessarily have to be specific with it. You don't have to decide in advance what the focus of those guides or videos is going to be. Because then when you come round to them, you can adapt to whatever the latest data is telling you. And particularly, to use the Halfords example from Kev that I've used a couple of times already, if it's FAQs, you could say, well, we're going to look at what products are actually popular at this time and what content is high priority during the summer months that we need to make sure we have FAQs about. And if you, again, give yourself the time to plan that and adapt to it when you come round to it, rather than feeling like you need to know all this in advance, you'll be able to much more effectively meet the requirements of your audience at the time. So those are just a few examples. Hopefully there's something useful in there or it's got you thinking. But finally, I just want to kind of sum up where we've been so far before I get round to a few of the questions that have come through. So, marketing plans will never stop being important, but we can't predict everything. And if we accept that we can't predict everything, then we'll be able to plan much more effectively for the things that we can't really plan for until they arise. As contradictory as it sounds, if we accept it, we'll at least be prepared to deal with those situations when they arise in the future. Secondly, we can look at case studies from the pandemic. I've given you a few here, but there are loads more out there. When we're looking at case studies from the pandemic, rather than thinking, oh, this kind of thing will never happen again, we can look at these and we can learn from them and see, well, what can we take from this to make sure that when similar things happen, albeit hopefully on a much smaller scale in the future, how can we make sure that we can adapt and react as effectively as many companies did during the pandemic? And finally, using the things I've just mentioned here, we can use real-time data. We need to focus on aligning our topical content with our wider goals. And we want to make time to plan ahead to address our latest topics. And all of this is to make sure that we're really able to be prepared and able to address topics as they arise, rather than having to scramble and adapt to things at the last minute. And I think that is everything. So thank you very much for listening. I think we'll come to a couple of questions at the end, but if you do want to contact me, sorry, I've probably gone on to this a little bit too quickly. The details are just there on the slide. Yep, there it is. If you do want to contact me, you can reach me by email here or on Twitter at BenJGarry. And as I said, if you want to listen to the podcast, we do one every couple of weeks, so that would be great. But yes, now I'll get into the questions. Cool. So I think hopefully I'll be able to get to all of these. So first up, we have, in non-COVID times, is it still possible to benefit from unpredictable trends? Absolutely, yes. Those trends might not be as big as they have been during COVID, and they might not be as all-encompassing for the nation, but there are always news stories breaking in your industry. there will always be things that concern your audience and that you have someone in your business who can have an opinion on it. So I think as long as we're aware of what's going on in our industries at all times, we can still see the benefits, even if the sort of highs and lows are less dramatic than they are during COVID. So hopefully that answers that question. So next up, do you think the pandemic offers a great opportunity for businesses to build their brand identity, becoming thought leaders in their markets, even if revenue is struggling at present? Yes, I want to preface this by saying it's going to be different for every brand, because some are going to find it easier to have these conversations than others. And hopefully now we have a bit of a roadmap for coming out of lockdown. It's a bit easier for brands to kind of see what the future holds for them and understand how they're going to start re-engaging with their customers. But I think even if people aren't able to engage with your products or services, maybe you've got high street shops that aren't able to open, or maybe you're a hospitality business that aren't able to open, you can be laying the groundwork now to keep that conversation going. Like Marmalade was doing with the PR campaign, they worked out what was relevant for their audience and created content for that. In hospitality, that might be really difficult because people can't come in and engage in person with you, but maybe you could be looking at things like kind of how the industry is going to recover, or what people can expect when they start coming out of lockdown, and just start looking at, you know, your audience is still going to be there in a couple of months' time. So what is that target market thinking right now, and how can you talk to them about that, and how can you show them that you're still present, that you still care, and that you're still worth engaging with? Those are the questions that it's really worth asking yourself. Next up, we've seen, have you seen growth in customers searching for sustainability type products as a result of the pandemic? If so, do you think this will stay? So I'm trying to think if I have any specific examples off the top of my head for sustainability products. I know there are certain industries, for example, we've worked with catering businesses that work with sort of disposable products. And there was already a trend towards eco products on their site already. And there was maybe a kind of consciousness that this was a good idea. And I don't know exactly what those trends have been since the pandemic started. Obviously, being in catering and hospitality is a difficult industry anyway. But I do think that people have maybe been a bit more conscious about maybe what customers are looking for and how to actually keep engaging with their customers. And I think sustainability, I caught some of the talk earlier, and sustainability is a really good way to show people that you're really committed to kind of meeting the, I guess, kind of the ethical requirements and the value considerations that they have. Which means that I think the more you can do that, and the more that you can show people that you're willing to have these conversations and willing to listen to them, especially if you're receiving feedback, I think the better you will come out of this pandemic. As to how much this will stay, I mean, I think we'd all like to think that some of these behaviors and people maybe having a bit more of a desire for sustainable products will stay beyond the pandemic. Honestly, I don't know. I think it's impossible to predict at this point. I think probably a lot of behaviors will go back to normal. But I would like to see that, you know, brands who've made these commitments during the pandemic, I think they will maybe maintain a lot of trust with their audiences if they maintain the messages and don't just suddenly drop the sort of the goodwill and the sustainability messages once things start getting back to normal, because I think that will show that they've got a bit of integrity and that they were serious about it in the first place, which hopefully customers will respond to. But yeah, it's all guesswork at this stage. It's all sort of up in the air. And finally, how do you avoid looking like your business is jumping on a certain bandwagon? Is it about getting in early or something else? This is a really, really good question. And there are certain topics that I think maybe a bit more sensitive topics that I think you can look a bit more, if you don't do it in the right way, you can look a bit more like you're jumping on the bandwagon. And just recently, I'm thinking of things I saw on social media around International Women's Day. There were some examples on there where there was very quick backlash because businesses clearly just tried to trot something out quickly. And it was either very insensitive or just not very well thought through. And I think people can see through it when you're not being genuine. So I think if you stick with kind of talking about topics that actually have a reason to be talking about, for International Women's Day, for example, hopefully every business has a reason to be talking about that in the right way. But if it's sort of a smaller topic or something maybe relative to just your audience, a subsection of your audience or your industry, Stick to things that you actually have a reason to talk about, and things that you have expert knowledge in as well. Because I think, again, people can see from a mile off if you're just doing a sort of templated comment that doesn't have any real sort of insight or feeling behind it. But I think if you're constantly trying to put out really high quality content that you've put the time into to research and seek expert opinions from inside or even possibly outside your business, I think that's when people will respond a bit better to it. And people will say, oh yeah, that company has something to say about this issue, rather than just trotting out an expected response. And if it is something that's maybe a bit more of an ethical issue, then I think responding to it with really tangible action is helpful as well. Because I think there are lots of issues where it's easy just to put out a response with words and then never change anything. But again, people can smell that from a mile off. So wherever possible, if you can back things up with action and show beyond whatever content it is that you're committed to doing a good job of whatever you're talking about, I think, again, that shows people that you're serious and hopefully gives them a more favorable view of the brand. And I think that's everything for the questions. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope that was useful. And please do let me know if you have any questions or want to engage after this.